Test. Are you ready, Jason? YouTube's ready and everything? Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So we're in Daniel 8. We got about midway through. I think I'm going to back up a few verses just to kind of get the context to where we're at. So we'll start in verse 15, and I'll just sort of recap a few things that we talked about last week. So chapter 7 started with a vision of 4 beasts. Chapter 8 kind of narrows that focus down to 2 of those 4, and they're described a little differently. So in chapter 7 is kind of a rehash of some of the things from chapter 2, but chapter 7 talks about 4 beasts, with the kingdoms being Babylon, then the Medes and Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. And what we're doing in chapter 8 is we're focusing on 2 of those 4 empires. And instead of calling them beasts, one's called a ram and the other's called a goat in this chapter. Chapter 7, a lot of the stuff's in it's pretty highly debated about what some of it means and so forth. But chapter 8 is for the most part, pretty universally agreed on what it means. And partly that's because it kind of explains itself, so it's kind of hard to misinterpret some of it. So with that in mind, so what has happened so far in the chapter is Daniel has seen the vision, but now he's going to have the vision explained to him. And so that's going to be the latter half of the chapter. So picking up in verse 15, So it says, "Then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man." So this is going to be an angel that is going to tell us that in a second. So an angel is going to appear to him. Not sure why this is rocking tonight, but anyway. So there's going to be an angel that's going to appear to him, and he's going to explain the dream to him, or the vision. Verse 16, it says, "And I heard a man's voice." So angels are typically described in the Bible as looking like a human, sounding like a human, at least when they appear to humans. They have that appearance. So it says, "And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulah, who called and said," and so it's kind of assumed that this individual here that's going to call out and talk to Gabriel is probably God himself telling Gabriel what to go do. So this individual, possibly God, is going to say, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So we now have an angel actually given a name here. And like I mentioned last week, the name Gabriel means like warrior of God is probably an acceptable definition for his name. So Gabriel is told by presumably God, "Go explain what the vision means to Daniel." All right, so verse 17, "So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end.'" So there's a couple things I didn't really point out here right at the end of class last time. First of all, even in the presence of an angel, humans are often fearful, particularly when they realize the angel is sent by God. And we're going to see some greater fear here in just a second in the next verse. But a couple other things. The angel calls Daniel a son of man. This phrase happens almost 100 times in the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel's referred to as a son of man. It's not the same concept that we saw in an earlier chapter when the Son of Man was referring to the Messiah, nor is it the same idea when Jesus calls himself this same term. Here it basically means that you're talking about them being a human, okay? So that's a little different than what we saw in a previous chapter. But the last thing I want to kind of mention on this verse, so it says that the vision refers to the time of the end. And this is where some people do get a little confused about the interpretation of the dream, if you're going to get confused about it. So, or I should say vision, not dream. So when it says the time of the end, some people say, oh, this is talking about the end times. And then they start extrapolating things about, what is it going to, trying to make this apply to the end times things and so forth. That's not what the phrase means here. Here it means, I'm going to explain to you what the end of the vision means. So the things happening at the very end of the vision is what he's talking about. Not end times, but what is contained in the vision itself. What is that talking about? So it's two different things. All right, so that's where we left off last week. So start with that in mind, we'll pick up now in 18. So it says, now as he was speaking with me, meaning Gabriel speaking to Daniel, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright. So Daniel is so fearful once he encounters Gabriel and realizes he's encountering God through Gabriel, that he falls into a deep sleep. And the deep sleep term there is, you see it a few times in the Old Testament. It's a sleep usually caused by God for somebody to fall asleep, like when Adam fell asleep so that God could take one of his ribs to make Eve. That's the same term used there. Anyway, it's a sleep that usually is something brought on by God. When Jonah fell asleep in the ship, during the storm, it's the same idea. But anyway, he's touched by Gabriel, and Gabriel makes him stand up. And the idea with him being made to stand by the angel Gabriel is that the reason he is bowed down with his face to the ground is because he's recognizing that he is a sinful human, and he can't appear before God in that state, okay? And so that's a lesson for all of us to kind of take, that as humans, we can't really appear before God. We can with Christ's blood, but short of with Christ's blood, we can't appear before God in our current state with our sins. We're not worthy of that. And so Daniel is acknowledging that by having his face to the ground. But when Gabriel touches him and tells him to stand up, what he's telling him is, you're forgiven, you're viewed as righteous by God, and you need to stand up because you're being called to be a prophet, and you need to stand up and take the position that God has for you. So when he touches him and kind of acknowledges that to him, then Daniel does stand up to do the role that God has chosen him to do. All right, so verse 19. It says, and he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. So what he's talking about is, I'm going to explain to you what's going on at the very end of the vision that you didn't understand. And he calls it the time of the indignation. And what it's referring to, indignation, they're referring to what is going to make God very angry, that it's occurring at the end of the vision. So the things that occurred in the vision are going to make God angry because of what is happening, but also because God is going to fight for his people due to the anger that he has. Okay? So if you don't remember from last week, what was the vision about? We won't go through the semantics of all the vision, but the gist of it is, one is the Medes and Persians, and they're eventually going to be defeated by the Greeks with Alexander the Great. And so Alexander the Great is going to defeat them. But after Alexander the Great dies, his kingdom is split into 4 kingdoms. And then eventually you get down, in one of those 4 kingdoms, you're going to get down to a ruler called Antiochus IV, who is very, very evil. And that's what's going to be talked about here in a second, that Gabriel's going to explain to him. And so that's really what the gist of the dream's really about. And I keep calling it a dream. It's a vision. I shouldn't say dream. All right, so verse 19, it says, and he said, look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be. So in other words, there will be an end to the indignation. Now, the key thing to notice here is that there is an appointed time for the indignation to end. And what is that telling us? It's telling us that God is in control of all things. God is in control of world events, leaders, and so forth. And God knows that this evil is going to happen, but he also has a time that he's going to bring it to an end. So that's something for us to kind of think about even in our own society if we think things are going the wrong direction or we think certain rulers are bad or whatever. And if they truly are, then God is going to bring it to an end in his time. So he has a time set that he is going to allow the things run its course, but he's going to stop it eventually, okay? All right, so verse 20, it says, the ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. So the ram was the first animal we saw in this particular vision. That's Media and Persia. And then verse 23, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. So those were the two kingdoms we're seeing in this vision. So the goat had a large horn, which is going to be the next sentence here. The large horn that is between its eyes, the goat's eyes, is the first king. So the first king of the Greek Empire is Alexander the Great. So verse 22, as for the broken horn, and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And so what that's talking about is when Alexander died, he had 2 sons, but they were very, very young. So he didn't have an heir that could take over at that time. And so his 4 generals fought for who would get control. His 2 sons were killed, his wife was killed, Alexander's sons and wife were killed, and his 4 generals split up the empire into 4 parts. And so that's what it's talking about there at the end. It says, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. So the 4 kingdoms individually will not be as powerful as the one kingdom was before it was split up. And so that's the idea there. Okay, so verse 23, and in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. So now what it's getting more specific. So Alexander dies, the kingdom's broken into 4 parts. Now it's going to talk about what's going to happen within one of those 4 parts. So this is the Seleucid Empire that occupied the regions of Palestine, Israel, Syria, that kind of thing. And so it's going to start talking about what's going to happen within that subsection or that fourth of the kingdom. And what's going to happen over a period of time, there's going to be several rulers, but eventually you're going to get down to a ruler that takes over, and his name is Antiochus IV, but he goes by the name Antiochus Epiphanes, which is a name he gave himself. So Epiphanes means like magnified one, something like that. And so basically what he is doing by giving himself that title is he's declaring himself to be a god or a godlike figure. And so that's what the latter part of the verse is about. So when it says a king shall arise having fierce features, I think the ESV gives a different term there. It says a bold face. And then it says who understands sinister schemes. So the idea with him understanding sinister schemes means he knows how to manipulate people and deceive people and use people for his own power, is what that's talking about. Now, if you go back up to the second line of that verse, it says, when the transgressors have reached their fullness. What that's probably referring to are the Jews that actually aligned themselves with him. So what happened when the Greek Empire took over and it got split up into the 4 empires? Some of the Jews actually ended up siding with the Greeks, and they actually really liked the Greek culture, and they wanted to bring the Greek culture into the Jewish society and basically get rid of Judaism, essentially. So what they did, along with Antiochus, is they did things like they no longer allowed circumcision, and then Antiochus did stuff beyond that, which he forbade having a copy of the Torah. You could be killed for that. He erected an altar in the temple on top of God's altar, probably in the shape of Zeus, maybe even in the shape of himself, that they offered pagan sacrifices in the temple for that. They did a lot of other things in the temple that were basically to corrupt the temple. They took all the things out of the temple, like the lampstands and all that stuff, took all that out. I think they even had some pagan sexual services in the temple and so forth to profane the temple. The Jews in favor of all this, they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, and that doesn't sound like a big deal on the surface. You're maybe thinking like a YMCA type thing. That's not really what it is for sports and athletics, but it's really for bringing in Greek culture, so they would teach Greek culture there and all kinds of stuff. The men that wanted to participate in the games at the gymnasium, they would do it in the nude, but to look Greek, you would have to get your circumcision reversed, which they would do. So some of the Jews really went full tilt into the Greek culture and left Judaism and tried to swing the rest of the Jews to do the same. So when you look at the second line of verse 23, that's what it's talking about. It says, when the transgressors have reached their fullness. So when this transition or these groups of Jews leaving Judaism for Greek culture, when that kind of hits its peak, that's when these other things are going to happen. All right, so verse 24, it says, his power shall be mighty. So Antiochus, he will be a mighty ruler, but not by his own power. So what that is saying is he is ruling and he has might, but it's only because God has given it to him, okay? Now, just because God makes somebody a ruler doesn't mean that all the bad stuff they do is because of God. So God can make someone a ruler, and then they can abuse the power that they have. And that's what Antiochus does. So just because God appoints rulers does not mean God approved of what Antiochus did. And so that's two different concepts. But he's got power because God gave him power. He just then abused the power that he was given. All right, so it says, he shall destroy fearfully and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. So he did trick the Jews. He did kill a lot of the Jews. And so that's kind of what that's referring to. All right, so verse 25, it says, through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. So he was very deceitful. He tricked the Jews, especially the ones who had not converted to the Greek way of thinking. He tricked some of them, killed a bunch of them. It says, and he shall exalt himself in his heart, which is what he did. So that's referring to him calling himself Epiphanes. He actually had coins minted with Antiochus Epiphanes on the coin, and so forth. And the coin actually, it's interesting. So the Greek Empire here is referred to as a goat with a single horn. And Antiochus, well, let me back up. There's a coin of Alexander the Great it's a side profile. So it shows a single ram's horn on his head on the coin, but it's only one side, so you would assume there would be two horns. But anyway, there's a coin of Alexander with a ram's horn, or a goat's horn on his head, and that whether that has anything to do with the goat here, I'm not sure. But anyway, just to let you know that does exist. But back to Antiochus, he exalts himself in his heart, so he makes himself basically to be a god or godlike figure. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes. And so the prince of princes here is God himself. So it's saying that he is going to rise up against God. So all this stuff he's doing is actually fighting against God. So he views it as fighting against Judaism, trying to, suppress the people he's in charge of and so forth. But in reality, by doing that and by desecrating the temple, he's actually fighting against God. And so what is the end result of anybody who fights against God? Well, eventually you don't win that fight, right? Nobody wins that fight. And so what is the last line of 25? It says, but he shall be broken without human means. And so what that means is he is going to die as a result of this stuff he does, but he will not be assassinated. He will die of what will look like natural causes. And so that is what happened to Antiochus. So this reign of terror that he does on the Jews only lasts about 3 years, and then God kills him for it, essentially, okay? And so if you back up then and notice what we talked about earlier, there is an appointed end when this is going to happen. So God knows this is going to take place. God already has a pre-planned end for when he's going to stop this. And so this lasts about 3 years, and then God brings it to an end. All right, so verse 26, and the vision of the evenings and mornings, which was told is true, therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. So remember, Daniel is seeing this vision, we'll just say around 550-ish BC, and the events of the vision, at least the part with Antiochus Epiphanes, doesn't occur until roughly the 160s BC, so almost 400 years later. And so that's why it's saying this is going to be in the future. So seal it up. This will be for the future. Okay. All right, so verse 27, it says, and I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished, the ESV says appalled, by the vision, but no one understood it. And so a couple of points here. One, anytime a human sees a vision from God, they tend to react like this. They're very overwhelmed. In Daniel's case, he was sick for days. So his reaction to this vision is worse than the one in chapter 7. And why is his reaction worse to this vision than the one in chapter 7? Well, because in this vision, he sees how bad the impact is going to be on the Jewish people. And so that really makes him basically sick at his stomach to think about his people being harmed like this. But afterwards, he eventually gets up and he just goes back to work, essentially. Now, when it says that no one understood it at the end, it doesn't mean that he didn't understand the parts that were explained to him. It just means that this is so far off in the future that he doesn't really understand it all. Because remember, at this point, he is still under Babylonian rule. The Medes and Persians haven't even taken over yet, much less thinking about the Greek Empire coming in, who Alexander the Great will be, who Antiochus IV will be. All these people are off in the future. He doesn't know who these people are. So even though points of the vision are explained to him, the fullness of the vision still doesn't quite make sense to him. Only in retrospect, after these events occur, would it totally make sense. All right, so why is this even in here? Why is Daniel allowed to see it? Why does he record it? Well, for the Jews, a couple of things. One, it's going to give Daniel and the Jews in captivity hope. Why? Because it talks about the temple being rebuilt, right? So the temple has to be in existence for these things to occur. And at this point in time, when he's seeing the vision, the temple back in Jerusalem is destroyed. So the vision is telling him that the Jews will go home from captivity, they will rebuild the temple, they will go through this really bad period, but they will go back home. So right now when he's seeing it, they're in captivity, the temple's destroyed. So it tells you that God is going to let them go home, they are going to rebuild the temple. But it's also intended to give them hope. So when these things do happen to the Jewish people, they can read the book of Daniel and say, God told us this was coming, and it's going to last a brief and definite period of time, and then it will come to an end. So that's the reason for the Jewish people. Now, what about for Christians? It's the same idea. So God will allow these kind of things to happen for his own reasoning and reasons. So you may have bad rulers pop up, they may persecute Christians and so forth, but this is to show us that God is in control and that these things have a finite period of time and they will eventually cease. And so it's supposed to give us comfort in that regard as well. But that is chapter 8. Does anybody have any comments or questions on 8? Yeah. Yeah, so he's Antiochus the Fourth. So obviously there was a first, second, and third. I don't know which of the Antiochuses the Antioch is named after, probably the first one. But yes, Antioch is named after Antiochus, okay? Probably not this Antiochus, probably one of his grandfathers. But yeah, good question, Sandy. Any other comments or questions? Okay. All right, chapter 9 is going to be different as well. Chapter 9 is really a prayer, is what chapter 9 is. So chapter 7 and 8 were still, while Daniel was still under Babylonian rule. It tells you in the first verse of each that Belshazzar is still the king. But now in chapter 9, it says, we're in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. So we have now moved into the Medes and Persian Empire being the world power, and Daniel is serving in their administration. So we've moved forward in time a little bit. So first year of Darius, that is the year of 538. So chapter 7 was around 553-ish. Chapter 8 was around 551-ish, depending on the dating you want to use. Now we've moved forward basically about 12 years, 13 years, something like that, into the Medo-Persian Empire. All right, so verse 2, it says, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So, sorry, I meant to mention one other thing from verse 1. So, the first year of Darius, if you remember what significant event occurred in the first year of Darius that we already talked about, and that would be the Daniel lion's den story, okay? So this prayer that Daniel's offering may have been just a few weeks after he was tossed into the lion's den situation. So it and that chapter are pretty closely linked in time to one another. All right, so when you look at verse 2, what Daniel is telling you is, he's telling you he's a student of the Old Testament. And so what he's saying in verse 2 is, I was reading through Jeremiah, and I noticed that Jeremiah on 2 occasions said that the captivity in Babylon would last 70 years. So the captivity began in 605 and Daniel was one of the ones captured in 605 and taken to Babylon. So if you remember from the beginning of the book, he was a teenager, most likely, when he was captured and taken to Babylon in 605. If you do the math, we're now in 538. So what is 605 from 538? How many years have passed since the captivity started? We're now in the 68th year. Okay, so Daniel's reading Jeremiah. Jeremiah says this is going to last about 70 years. And we're in year 68. So he's thinking, this thing should be about to run its course, right? And he's also thinking that the event that's going to spark the Jews being let to go back home would be that Babylon is no longer the world power. So Babylon is the one that took them into captivity, not the Medes and Persians. But now the Medes and Persians have taken over, and they have a different way of dealing with this kind of situation. And generally speaking, they don't really care about keeping captives like this, like Babylon did. And so Daniel is thinking, okay, according to Jeremiah, this should be about over, and the Medes and Persians are a more likely group to let us go back. And so that's going to spark some thoughts in his head, which is going to lead to the prayer that we're about to start reading. Now, a couple things to kind of note. He says that he kind of pieced this together by reading Jeremiah. The prayer, it's got so many references in the Old Testament, I can't even stop to tell you all of them. It would take hours. But he is almost every sentence of this prayer is going to reference Jeremiah or the Torah, particularly Deuteronomy and Exodus. And he's going to reference multiple times Solomon's prayer that Solomon gave when he dedicated the temple. So basically every sentence in here is either quoting from one of those passages or alluding to those passages, okay? So if you want to ask yourself, why even study the Old Testament? You could not quote and come up with a prayer like this unless you knew it all, okay? And so he obviously read it, he obviously knew it, but to have a deep understanding of God's will for your life, what God wants, what God demands, requires that you be in the Word constantly. And Daniel obviously was, okay? And so that's the only reason he can even come up with a prayer like this, because he was obviously constantly reading Scripture. All right, so verse 3, it says, "Then I set my face towards the Lord to make request by prayer and supplications with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes." Now, we're used to hearing the phrase or the allusion to repentance in the Old Testament with ideas of fasting, sackcloth, ashes, that kind of thing. But you might be surprised to know that the three only occur together like that 3 times in the whole Old Testament. Once in Esther, once in another book I'm blanking on at the moment, and here, okay? So Daniel sticks all 3 together here. Now, why would he do that? He's basically letting you know how sad and repentant he is, okay? Now, what you're going to see in this prayer, he's going to use the first common plural pronoun instead of the first common singular pronoun, and that's a fancy way of saying he's going to say we instead of me or I, okay? Or instead of saying they. All right, so when you think about Daniel, he seems like a righteous guy so far, right? So when he maybe starts laying blame for why are the people in captivity, why are they still in captivity, you might not think he would point the finger at himself because he is righteous. The whole book has suggested so far. But what you see in the Old Testament, even when things go south and when things go bad, even the righteous people take the blame on themselves, and it's called corporate solidarity. So in the Jewish mindset, if the people sinned, that meant they all were guilty, okay? So the nation was as a whole. So even if you were innocent, technically, you still viewed yourself guilty because the nation was guilty. And that's what Daniel is doing here. So as we kind of read through the prayer, and I know the bells are going to ring before we even get far into it, but read it in terms of our country today and see if it applies and see if we can say we instead of they as we read it. Because though we might look around and say, well, our country's problems is not my fault because I don't do X, Y, and Z like all the other people in this country, that is bringing all the problems upon us. The truth of the matter is we're all guilty in one way or another. We all are guilty before God. Maybe it's not because we're doing overt things. Maybe it's because we're not converting people. Maybe it's because we're not talking to other people about Christ. Maybe it's because we're too scared to stand up. We're all guilty, and Daniel is taking the blame upon himself for the guilt of his people, okay? All right, so with that in mind, verse 4, it says, "And I prayed to the Lord, my God." This is the first time in the book of Daniel that he actually uses the name Yahweh. And it's only used in this chapter in the prayer. So why would he use Yahweh instead of, he's going to bounce back and forth. So if your Bible is one that when it uses Yahweh, it capitalizes all the letters, you'll be able to see it. Sometimes he says Yahweh, sometimes he says Adonai, which is big L with little O-R-D. So he's going to bounce back and forth between the terms. But when he uses Yahweh, he is referring to the covenant relationship between God and his people. And what he is saying is God and his people had a covenant, and the people messed it up. Okay, so it's the people's fault. It's not God's fault. And so he's going to appeal to the covenant to make an appeal to God to save the people. Okay? All right, so verse 4, it says, "And I prayed to Yahweh, my God, and made confession and said, oh," now here it says Adonai, not Yahweh, but it says, "O Lord, great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and mercy." So again, he's referring to the covenant here. Now, the word for mercy there is hesed, which means, it's translated a lot of different ways, and I know you've heard me mention this before. ESV says steadfast love. That's a common way it's translated. But really what the word means is covenant loyalty. So God and the Israelites made a covenant. God never breaks the covenant. The people do. And what happens anytime you have a covenant, if one party breaks the covenant, the other party is no longer obligated to keep their part of the contract. And so the people had violated the covenant, but God often would still keep his end of the bargain, even when he did not have to, and that's called mercy. And so that's what he is playing on here, or alluding to. It says, you keep your covenant and your mercy with those who love him. So God will always keep his end of the covenant with the people that love him and keep his commands. It's the ones who don't keep the commands that have a problem. All right, so as you keep reading the sentence, it says, "and with those who keep his commandments." So God is always faithful for those individuals. Verse 5, it says, "We have sinned and committed iniquity." So now Daniel is throwing himself in with everybody else and basically is acknowledging that the people as a whole, including him, we've sinned, we've committed iniquity, we have done wickedly. Those first three, he's going to mention 5 sins, but those first 3 are straight out of Solomon's temple address, temple prayer when he dedicated the temple. So when Solomon dedicated the temple, he mentioned those 3 things, And then he appealed to God that if we ever sin and get taken into captivity, please help your people to repent and appeal to you to take us out of captivity. So that phraseology is straight out of Solomon's address. But then he's going to add two more to it to show how sorry he is. So he's going above and beyond what Solomon said. So if you look at verse 5, it says, we have sinned, that's 1, committed iniquity, 2, have done wickedly, 3, and then he's going to add, and rebelled, 4, even departing from your precepts and your judgments, that's 5. So he's going to say 5 things they've done wrong. It says, neither have we heeded your servants, the prophets. So he calls the prophets servants of God. He's going to do this multiple times. In a minute, he's going to say Moses is a servant of God. So he's one of the kind of few people in the Old Testament that call them servants and kind of keeps playing on that idea. All right, so keep going in verse 6. It says, who spoke in your name to our kings and our princes, that's straight out of Jeremiah, to our fathers and all the people of the land. So the prophets came, they told us we were doing wrong. But verse 7, O Lord, righteousness belongs to you, but to us shame of face. And you may have a different spin on that depending on your translation. I think some say shamed-faced even. So God is righteous, but the people are shameful. And it says, as is this day to the men of Judah. So the men of Judah to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the people of Judah are the ones taken captive in Babylon at the moment. And then he says, and to the ones still living in Jerusalem. So when Babylon took the captives, they didn't take everybody. So there were still Jews living in Jerusalem. So he says, those still in Jerusalem and all of Israel. Why would he mention Israel? Israel, if you remember, so the first wave when he got taken captive was 605. Israel, which is the other 10 tribes, they went into captivity in 721, over 100 years earlier. And what he is saying is he's looping in all 12 tribes of Israel and saying we're all guilty. And he says, he keeps going and he says, those near and those far off in all the countries to which you have driven them. So we're all guilty and you've spread us around all these different countries in captivity. And why has God done that? Because of the unfaithfulness which they have committed against you. So he's playing off the idea of the covenant. And he's calling on God's covenant name. And he's saying that all of your people have sinned before you. And we're all guilty before you. But you alone are actually still righteous. Now he's going to use that idea to make a couple of appeals to God later in the prayer that we're not going to have time to get into tonight. And I know the bell's going to ring here in a second, so I'll probably just stop here in the prayer. But does anybody have any questions or comments? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, is that the other one? Okay. Actually, Nehemiah quotes exactly from Daniel here it's Nehemiah 9, and 1:5 also, I think. Nehemiah quotes directly from Daniel in those passages. Any other comments, questions? All right. Good to see everybody. Hope you have a good rest of the week.